According to a review of the Federal Election Commission records, New York Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has been a vocal supporter of the Defund the Police movement, has spent thousands of dollars on personal security to an ex-Blackwater contractor.
Blackwater, which is now called Academy, was a private military company known for outfitting some of the harsher military contractors during the Iraq War. Washington editor at Spectator, Amber Athey, is back with us to discuss. Amber, why do people find this amusing? Is it the idea that they think that if she says that she is supportive of a defund the police movement, that she wants zero funding for all police and zero funding for anybody who is involved in security, and that this is some kind of a gotcha? Is that what's going on here?
Well, I think it is a bit of a gotcha because AOC is making decisions on behalf of people who don't want to defund the police, people in minority communities, for example, 70+% of whom say they actually either want to keep the current level of police or increase the police. Those people can't afford private security, right? So AOC is taking away their ability to have security in their own neighborhoods. But if it were to affect her, she would be able to buy her own private security to protect herself and her staff. So it does seem like there's a bit of hypocrisy here. I also personally find it quite amusing that the so-called progressive champion in the Democratic Party is funding the military-industrial complex by hiring an ex-Blackwater contractor. That seems a bit ironic to me.
But that guy, he's not, I mean, and I believe me, I'm very much a big vocal, opponent of the military industrial complex. But that being said, I mean, this person that she's hired is just someone who used to work for that company or contracted with them. I mean, he's not, I mean, my big beef with the military industrial complex and companies like Blackwater or Academy or whatever they're wanting to call themselves these days is the fact that the government is even giving them contracts at all. It's not necessarily the people that work for these companies that are former military, special ops, and then they go and, they have to have a livelihood, and that's what they know and what they're trained for, and then they go and work private security. I mean, I don't know if I have a problem with the individual. It's more about the actual company itself. So, but I do hear you on the hypocrisy of the police issue. It's the optics of defund the police. And what a lot of people heard was exactly what it says, which is defund the police, not scale back and invest in community. I mean, that was the overall message, but that's not what people heard. And then meanwhile, you have people like AOC getting her own, a private police officer to walk around with her. And on top of that, Democrats on the Hill are calling for more expansion of Capitol Police, which is, I think, hypocritical completely. So I hear you on that point.
Yeah, and even then, the squad split their votes on that bill that would increase funding for the Capitol Police because they realized that if all of them voted no on that bill, then it wouldn't pass. And so AOC and several of her colleagues decided to vote present instead so that the bill would pass, but they wouldn't be blamed for having this hypocritical position.
I think it does expose the flaw in the defund the police slogan. I think if she actually was a full-on police abolition advocate, then you'd be able to catch her in a gotcha here. But she's in the camp that 90+% of the people who support the defund movement are in, which is to say, like Kim said, reduce funding and move some of that funding over to social services. But any time that you have to explain that your slogan doesn't mean what it sounds like, you're starting from behind. But I do think this should also be a little bit of cause for reflection on the right. Reporter Andrew Feinberg noted on Twitter that conservative media generates reader outrage and death threats against members of Congress that requires extra security. Conservative media dunks on member of Congress for needing security because of death threats from their readers. I think that people, Andrew is a friend of this show, I think people should recognize that the kind of 24/7 machinery of hate that is Fox News and some other outlets has created actual threats to the lives of some members of Congress.
Well, let's be honest, that goes both ways. There are plenty of Republican members of Congress who have to have private security as well. I mean, it was Republicans, for example, who were shot at a baseball field. So let's not pretend that this only goes in one direction. And it is still, of course, the case that there are people across the country who face threats, who face violence in their communities. Homicides are up exponentially on last year, and yet they're not able to, again, afford the private security that AOC is. So just because she faces a particular, specific type of threat because she's a member of Congress doesn't mean that her life is worth anyone else who deserves police protection as well. And would,
right,
and
but
would
she doesn't.
Obvious.
She doesn't face it, though, because she's a member of Congress. She faces it because she's a particular member of Congress that the right-wing ecosystem has decided to, turn into an avatar of all that is kind of threatening and dangerous to America.
Sure, but I don't think you can say that criticizing someone and their political positions is necessarily a fomentation of hate.
Sure,
you can't really be held
stopped at that,
responsible
sure.
unless you,
but do you think
sure,
it stops
if
at just mere criticism?
I would
you don't
like
think there's
to
kind of an
someone
obsessive
on Fox News threatening AOC. I mean, if you can give me an example of that, then I think you have a point. But I don't think that, criticizing someone or talking about them in a negative manner, that you would be held responsible for some nutbag taking your opinions and using that to carry out a threat or try to harm someone, just like I don't think Bernie Sanders should be held responsible for his former staffer who shot up that baseball field.
Or it's more taking it, Kim, feel free to jump in here. Sorry if I'm monopolizing, but it's not as if they're saying, you ought to go out and commit physical acts of violence against these particular people. But if you say that this person is an enemy of the people, an enemy of the country, who is a traitor to the country, who is going to destroy America, what is that saying to people? Like, what are people supposed to say? Okay, well, that's unfortunate. What's on next?
I just think we're talking about a dangerous standard here, one that is obviously subjective. If you're looking at Maxine Waters, for example, saying that people should go out and give Trump supporters a hard time or harass them when they're out at restaurants or at the gas station, then does that count as implicit threat? Does that count as riling up people who are going to then go and commit violence? It's a subjective standard and ultimately one that is harmful to free speech.
I would like to see the rates of how often members of Congress are actually assaulted or attempts at assault or, what the real threat level is, because look, a lot of talk show hosts, you do have, to your point, Amber, a lot of right-wing talk show hosts like Glenn Beck and Ben Shapiro, Rush Limbaugh. They have to walk around, or, Rush not, but they had to walk around with a lot of security and they have to hire these people. And so because there are threats to them, also on the Hill, there's a lot of that perception, but I don't know how much of it actually ends up in reality. And of course, I guess there's an argument that could be made that, well, it's because they have the protection. But I would imagine that there are a lot of mothers in Chicago who would love to have the personal security for their children while they're walking to school or while they're out playing in the playground. Kids that are at much higher rates of risk than AOC or Ben Shapiro. Well,
just to answer your question, Kim, a man was sentenced to prison fairly recently for making a threat against Ilhan Omar. And if you've ever dealt with trying to take a threat to federal authorities, then you know that a threat has to be so specific, so detailed. Right. You basically have to give a time, a place, and a manner and a motive for why you're going to commit this act in order for the FBI to take it seriously. So the fact that somebody not only got on the radar of the police or of the FBI for a threat against Omar, but actually got convicted of it shows just how serious it must have been.
But that, again, is just one instance of this.
Well,
I would just
it doesn't take more than that. Yeah.
Right. But I mean, I'm wanting to know kind of the overall, what is the actual threat level for members of Congress, if they could even, kind of quantify this to justify. And now I believe that a lot of them, especially the high profile ones, AOC and people like Ben Shapiro, probably do need to have personal security. I'm not discounting that by any means. But this sort of the Capitol Police and ramping that up. It's really what is the actual threat and what kind of message are you sending to the American people, especially those who are talking about the defund the police movement. They're saying, when we have these police patrolling these neighborhoods and it just makes these people feel like they're just constantly under surveillance, like they're criminals. I don't know how that's any different when we're treating the American people the same way by saying you can't get this close to the Capitol, because we think you might potentially be a threat. It's that same sort of double standard messaging that I have a real big problem with, even though I am a big proponent of getting the police, moving into a direction of more community funding and less funding. We need to demilitarize. In general, this country is hyper militant, and we need to demilitarize. I don't know if any of this is really helping, though, and the hypocrisy is certainly showing. From my view.
Yeah, I mean, here's the deal. If AOC thinks that defunding the police means redirecting that funding to social workers, then she should probably replace about half of her staff of private security with guidance counselors. And if someone comes and threatens her, then she can see how that works out for her. And if it works for her, then it can work for the rest of the country. But until they're willing to do that for their own personal security, then what they're telling the American people is that their lives are more valuable than theirs.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Amber, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Amber.
Thanks.
Next on Rising, Kim Kelly joins us with an update on the Alabama miners who have been striking since April.